What is it like learning classical music after having mastered the jazz tradition? That is exactly what I'm going to address in this video, and something that I have experienced personally. I am a professional musician. I started my journey in jazz. My first piano lessons were in jazz. My first performances were in jazz. I went to conservatory for jazz. And then I got to this point where it was like, you know what, there's all of this other music besides jazz. I want to learn how to play it. And so then I started working on some classical music, and then I got to the point where I can start performing it, and so on and so forth. So, what was that like? It was very, very interesting, and also very, very challenging. And I think in a lot of ways, it's sort of the opposite of what a lot of people do. A lot of people start playing classical music and then start focusing on jazz. I went the other way. So I think there are a lot of really, really interesting things that I want to share in that. I think the first thing that I noticed as I started working on classical music, Bach pieces, Fauré, Chopin, is that I did not have the attention span required to practice and perform this music. I was so used to the spontaneity of jazz and the fact that it's, such an improvisatory and oral genre. And so I was sort of shocked when I started working on a classical repertoire, because it was like, how do I, number one, where do I start? And number two, I just didn't have I couldn't focus for that long. And I wanted just to learn the whole piece just right then and there. And so I think, obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that, and it takes a lot more time than I was, hoping it would take. So I think the first thing that I had to learn was to be really, really patient. The second thing that I had to learn was to actually learn the music. And I think in jazz, there are a lot of places where you can get away with really not knowing the music all that well. And so again, because it's such an oral music, and I think it's also because if you're playing a Charlie Parker head, you just have 32 measures of a melody. And if you're a piano player, obviously it's a little bit more complicated, but then you have all these tools and you know how to improvise over it, and that's just taken for granted in jazz. You know how to do that, and it's just something that you're not spending months and months and months and months and months, working on one single Charlie Parker. I mean, you might, but I never had to do that in my experience. So that was sort of the most surprising thing. Just the time it takes and really, really learning the music. You can't get away with only half learning it, because everybody will notice, that person really doesn't know the piece all that well. They haven't practiced it, not really prepared to perform it. And I think it takes a lot more effort, in actually learning the music than it does in jazz. I think in jazz, all the effort comes in improvisation. So that's one really, really big difference. I think the other really, really big difference is the fact that it is notated music on a score. Jazz is notated on a score, but in a very different way. Oftentimes, those are lead sheets with just the melody, and you have the chords on the top. Big band music is a little bit different. That gets a little bit closer to being completely fully notated, but it's still not quite the same thing, because in my experience playing in big bands, there are still places where you can kind of, make stuff up. It's not like, of course, there are some places where you have to play exactly what's written. But again, in big band music, in my experience, there are some places where it's still, you can still do a little bit of, improvisation within that. So again, classical music, pretty rigid in terms of, playing those notes exactly as they are written. I found that looking at different editions of the score was incredibly helpful. And just like listening to different recordings if I'm learning a jazz tune. So looking at different editions of the score, of course, also listening to different recordings. But I think in terms of actually learning the music, looking at these different editions, maybe one edition has a different dynamic marking and you're like, okay, well, what do I do here? And then you sort of consult that, you think about the period in which the music is written, and then of course, there is a little bit of room for interpretation in that realm. So, those are the pretty key differences that I found. What are some similarities? I found, especially when performing piano accompaniments. I'm a pianist, and so when I play classical music, I'm doing a lot of accompanying. I noticed that if I'm playing with a really good soloist who has the melody really together, and of course, I also have my part really, really together, and we work on the phrasing, and if the phrasing is really perfect, in my experience, that feels just as good as playing with an all-star jazz rhythm section who has the groove really, really down there. They've got the swing feel, the bass player is playing right on top of the quarter note. It's just perfect. And I found the same to be true when, performing classical music with a soloist. If the phrasing is there, then the groove is there. If the phrasing is not there, then it doesn't sound good. And I have heard a lot of classical musicians who don't perform the phrasing, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't sound all that good to me. And so I just think the phrasing is so incredibly important, and actually one of the things that after I learn the music, even, not completely, even if I'm just still a little bit rusty on some parts of the music, I am still working on phrasing. I'm like, well, how, should this measure be played? How should, this feel in terms of the rhythm? Should the measure slow down a little bit? Should there be, ornamentations put in? All of those kinds of questions. And I think when those are done correctly, when those are done in a way that serves the music well, it sounds really good, number one, but it also just feels really, really good to perform. Just, like I said, just as good as if I'm playing with a really great jazz rhythm section. Also, I have talked to a lot of classical musicians who have said listening is more important in jazz than it is in classical music. I would actually disagree with that. I think listening in both traditions is equally important, because how are you going to respond as a classical musician to, if you're performing in an ensemble, what those other musicians are doing? If you're not listening, you can't respond. How are you going to respond to their phrasing? If you're not listening, you can't. Just like in jazz, how are you going to respond if the bass player, drops out? If the bass player drops out and they want you to drop out, then you have to be listening and watching and doing all that. So I think the same definitely 100% holds true in classical music. I think classical music, I haven't performed it as much as I have performed jazz, and I'm hoping that, by the time, I get really, really good at classical music, that that I'm performing it equally. But in my experience learning this music, it has been actually tremendous fun, and just I really, really enjoy it. And it's something that I definitely want to continue with, even though it's only been a couple years that I've been at it. Compared to my probably over 10 playing jazz. So that has been my experience learning classical music. Would I recommend it? Absolutely. If that's something that you are willing to do, and if that's something that you're interested in doing, totally do it. Choose the repertoire that you like. Choose something maybe at the beginning that's easy, that you can learn without much hassle. but really, more importantly, choose stuff that you like to play. Listen to a bunch of classical music on whichever instrument you're playing, and just, you know, soak it all in, listen to it, choose what you like to perform. If you don't like to perform it, then it's not fun. So I think that's my one last piece of advice. But would I recommend it? Absolutely. So in a future video, I'm going to talk about the ways in which classical musicians, those people who grew up playing classical music, can very easily learn jazz. I think there are a lot of misconceptions around that, so watch for that video when I put that one out. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe to this channel. Please leave a comment. And finally, please share this video.